So today I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Dr. Steven Zhao, who is a clinical research fellow and registrar in rheumatology at the University of Liverpool and Aintree Hospital in Liverpool in the UK. Thank you for joining us, Steven. We are going to be discussing his work, Improving Rheumatoid Arthritis Comparative Effectiveness Research using the Target Trial Emulation Framework, which has been conducted in collaboration with the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School in the USA. So just to start with, Steven, please could you tell us a little bit about you and your work and how this project fits in with that?
Sure. So as you say, I'm still a training rheumatologist. As well as doing that, I am currently in the final year of my PhD, which looks at comorbidities in axial spondyloarthritis using real-world data. Now, to learn some of the methods needed for my degree, I went for a period of a research training at the Brigham, as you say. And this is really the birthplace of causal inference in epidemiology. So naturally, I developed an interest in it, and this work has kind of stemmed from that interest. And this work is predominantly hoping to introduce the concept of target trial emulation to the rheumatology community, but also to apply it to the rheumatology literature to see how it's relevant to us.
Okay, thanks. So you mentioned target trial emulation and introducing that to our viewers. So I, for one, don't know very much about that. Can you just explain a bit more about that methodology, please?
Absolutely. So we're all familiar with the fact that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard evidence in medicine. But they're not always available because trials can take a long time, and sometimes it might not be feasible or ethical to do certain trials. So in the absence of randomized trials, observational studies can be a source of important evidence to guide clinical practice. In fact, many of our daily treatment decisions in rheumatology come from observational data. Now, I know there's a healthy skepticism for observational studies, partly because limitations of the data, partly because methods can be opaque and subtle changes in the methods can influence the conclusions. So, I mean, look at the hydroxychloroquine study during this hydroxychloroquine story during this pandemic. We've seen real-world harms that have come from as a result of less robust observational studies. So, on the one hand, we know observational studies are important, but on the other hand, designing robust studies is challenging because many of the formal causal inference theory can be complicated and unfamiliar. Well, target trial emulation is an intuitive way of designing and conducting observational studies. It's beautifully simple, really. So you have a question, think about how you would run that question as a randomized controlled trial, and then use your observational data to emulate that trial. So for example, if you were doing a trial, you'd be thinking about things like eligibility criteria, treatment strategies, how you would assign patients to a treatment, how you would follow them up, the outcome, etc. So the same systematic design approach should be used in observational studies before you look at the data. And there have been many examples where this approach has been shown to reduce design flaws, reduce bias, and match results from observational studies to trials. I mean, it's a big and potentially complicated concept to unpack, in the short time we have. On the poster, there's a QR code that links to the full text version of this abstract where you can get a little bit more detail about each one of the components.
Okay, thanks for that. So you've explained a bit about how you'd use target trial emulation in the context of observational studies. So can you just talk a bit more about how you used it for this retrospective systematic review that you performed?
Sure. So you raise a really good point. The target trial emulation framework was conceived for designing observational studies. Now, what we did was use this framework to retrospectively, as you say, appraise existing studies. It's quite different. It's, as far as we know, the first instance where this has been used, this framework has been used in this way. And we think that's perfectly valid, and it provides readers a structured way to appraise existing studies. What we did was we specifically looked at how the authors designed their study according to each one of the 7 components of the framework to see what could be improved and what were potential sources of bias.
Okay. And this is specifically on studies on rheumatoid arthritis that you've looked at.
Absolutely.
So in your conclusion, you've said that 94% of the studies you looked at in rheumatoid arthritis had design flaws. So this is quite concerning. It's quite a high number. Does this mean we can't trust the results from these studies?
That's a really, really good question. So yes, we did indeed find that the vast majority of these studies had some design limitations. Now, these are just potential sources of bias. The only way to know if they critically biased a conclusion is to run a randomized control trial and see if the results match that from these observational studies, and we can't do that. So it's impossible for me to say. Advocates of this framework like to use the analogy of seatbelts. So we don't expect a crash every time we step into a car, but we maximize safety nonetheless to prepare for these eventualities. Likewise, just because the conclusion isn't changed every single time doesn't mean we shouldn't aspire for methodological rigor. So the examples that we reviewed in this abstract were quite simple observational designs comparing two biologics head to head. Now, there are, as you know, much more complicated designs that have a lot more potential to be biased. And in fact, there have been plenty of well-documented examples where self-inflicted faults could have been avoided had the design followed a target trial emulation framework.
Okay. Thanks. And I guess just finally, you've obviously now had quite a bit of experience using these methodologies. Do you have any specific advice for somebody who's in the process of designing comparative effectiveness research at the moment, or is thinking about doing it?
Yeah, that's important to highlight the take-home message, right? So I think the short version of that is think about how you would answer your question as a randomized control trial. And if you're a reader rather than a researcher, if you're a reader of these studies, think about, can these methods be conceptualized as a trial? So in this abstract, we found three typical areas that were problematic. Firstly is eligibility criteria. So for example, in observational studies, a lot of authors define eligibility by, say, patients had to have at least one follow-up. Now, immediately that becomes problematic if you think about it as a trial, because as a trialist, you can't see into the future to see if someone's going to come back to follow up, right? So beyond the conceptual difficulty, there's also sources of bias if adherence is different between the treatment groups. Okay. So in the observational study, we should not use post-baseline information to define eligibility. So that's the first point. Second point is causal contrasts, and by that I mean intention to treat or a protocol effect. Now, in a trial, whatever results they report, they'll say it's either from intentions to treat or a protocol analysis. Now, if you read through the observational literature, you see that those terms are hardly ever used. And we know that these effect sizes are different. We know that interpretations for clinical practice are different. So really, observational researchers should be declaring their causal contrast in the same way that trialists do. And the last thing, the third point, is the way observational researchers choose confounders. Now, one of the most popular ways to select confounders is according to statistical properties. So how are they associated with the exposure? How they're associated with the outcome? It's very popular and it's perfectly valid in prediction studies, but whenever we talk about causation, we really should be using our prior knowledge about what is an important confounder, backed up by literature search, backed up by causal diagrams if possible, rather than using simple statistical selection, because that's another source of bias. So if I had three pieces of advice to give, I would be saying things like eligibility criteria, causal contrast, and confounder selection. And that would apply to people reading observational studies as well. Think about those points.
Okay. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. And thank you for talking to us today on EULAR TV. You can check out Steven's poster, which is available now on the EULAR 2020 eCongress platform. Thank you for talking to us, Steven.
Thank you, Minnie.